Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and as always, thank you for listening, and thank those of you who've chosen to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Indeed,
we appreciate that.
We so appreciate. David, I bring you greetings from my new friends in South Georgia. I went to give a talk. I met this
sounds
super
frightening.
fan.
Yeah, the super fan.
Yeah, she was great. Her name is Martha, and she's a lawyer, and her husband Nathan is a great guy. And they took me to dinner along with her parents and four couples, and we had this incredible meal.
And did you let on that I don't really exist? I'm an automaton?
I said you were actually done on a soundstage in Hollywood, just like the moon landing. But they congratulated you and said that they would love to meet you sometime, and they're big fans.
I have never been to Georgia.
Oh, well, I hadn't been there for a while. I'm going again next week, as it turns out. But this was something. I mean, these guys were so in tune that they knew more about what I do than I do.
That's a little frightening.
And they were like finishing sentences, and it was like
really frightening.
I felt I had gone into like a fantasy world where the ideal listeners, the people who actually give themselves to this program, and they all wanted to change the world and live in an enlightened society, and they're Jeffersonians to the core. Although the superfan was once a Hamiltonian, and she finally was brought around.
Maybe we should call her and do a little interview with her
great.
and Jefferson.
Oh, it was something. Anyway, so they all said hello, and they're planning to come on the Lewis and Clark adventure. So we'll see. But as you know, I get a lot of mail from around the country, and people say, well, my husband and I go out and we don't get good radio coverage in our house, so there's this ridge where we go park the car when your show is on. I think, wow, dream higher, folks. And then other people say, I heard this program and it changed. It helped. I'm a reader now because of something that you said, or this helped me to think about the difference between an impeachment resolution and the trial in the Senate, or you helped me to think about how the Senate is paralyzed by giving each state two senators, even though North Dakota has a population of 700,000 and California 51 million. And so when I get those kind of testimonials or meet people in my travels, then I always think, well, now I have a face. Now I have, now I can think about the people who are listening, and it helps me. It gives me a sense that we're not just sitting here in the barn or in the studio, but there is a real world out there of people for whom this matters.
And they do respond. And I have to say, without, it's been noted that the last couple of podcast intros have approaching 10 minutes.
I'd like to know who ratted us out, who's got a stopwatch.
I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but before we do go to the show, we've got a couple of letters from people who, one Ed Gibbs wrote, I was so excited yesterday at the Chrysler Museum exhibit in Norfolk, Virginia. Not only did I get to see an incredible exhibit, but you will be coming back to the Hampton Roads area on November 20th for the Thomas Jefferson Architect exhibit.
I love the Chrysler Museum. It is a fabulous museum in the Chesapeake, the lower Chesapeake.
So it's not like an official appearance or performance. You're just going to see it.
I'm giving a talk.
Oh, are you?
And I will talk about architecture, but I don't pretend to be an architectural historian. So I say things like, yeah, that's a building. That's got a dome, doesn't it?
Okay,
yeah. But I'm going there, and you know what else I'm doing? I'm doing in the spring. I'm doing this program at the Roper Theater, where I'm just me. It's kind of like Clay Jenkinson Unplugged, and I'm going to tell funny stories.
Boy, that could be dangerous.
Yeah, I'm going to tell funny stories, and and some of them might be about you, but I'm going there, and it's going to be.
You think I'm funny?
My grandmother's pickle story.
Well, it's funny. Yeah.
The time I met Kobe Bryant in a 25-story hotel. Yeah, when I was dressed as Theodore Roosevelt, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be in the spring.
Okay, let's wrap this up. I just want to say thank you to everybody who has taken time to support the show. We really appreciate it. Go to jeffersonhour.com.
I'm not allowed to beg anymore.
Click on donate, and no, I'm begging for you. And also, you can find out everything you want to know about Clay's cultural tours at jeffersonhour.com. And with that, sir, may we go to the show?
And hello to the Georgia 11 who changed my life.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, you and I recently had somewhat of a self-indulgent on my part conversation, and I enjoyed it very much. It was about some occurrences during my time, sir. I spoke to you about the 50th anniversary of America landing men on the surface of the moon and their safe return to Earth. And I sort of had the feeling that you were skeptical that this could occur. Have you come to terms with that, sir?
I lived to see the beginnings of the age of steam. I knew that human inventiveness knows no bounds, but I still have a very considerable skepticism about what it would take to lift some sort of tonnage off the face of the earth and send it elsewhere. You know, when Meriwether Lewis went up the Missouri River in 1804, he was carrying about 60,000 pounds worth of baggage, and he had to hire almost 50 young men to propel his flotilla against the current of the Missouri River. And the more number of men that he added, the more rifles he needed, the more ammunition, the more food, the more clothing, etc. And so the problem of moving a payload against the forces of gravity is something that I know very well indeed. And I have considerable doubt that a motive force could be found that would do this. You know, hot air balloons were quite common, just beginning to really be commonplace in my time. I saw exhibitions in Philadelphia and again in France. And these were being lifted by hydrogen, which is lighter than the surrounding air. But it would take an awful lot of balloon and a great deal of hydrogen to lift 20 tons, let's say.
You, sir, as much as any president our nation has ever had, you are known as a statesman of science. You wrote to John Adams on October 28th, 1813, quote, "Science had liberated the ideas of those who read and reflect, and the American example had kindled feelings of right in the people."
Yes, this is when Adams and I had been reconciled, and we were beginning tentatively to write candid letters to each other. Now, I should say, and I don't in any way wish to quibble with your citation of that letter, that science in my time meant something broader than it means in your time. It meant knowledge. So knowledge perhaps with a scientific edge to it, but knowledge generally was called science from the Latin root. So yes, I believe that the truth, that the seeking of information, the gathering of facts, the understanding of how the world works, Newtonian mechanics, the constituents of the air, including oxygen and hydrogen and helium and nitrogen and so on, the periodic table of elements, the Linnaean classification of plants and by extension of animals, taking the temperature and learning something about climate. All of these things are what Lord Bacon called the patient gathering of facts. You could call it science in the broad sense of the term, but it was not all hard science in the sense in which that term is used in your own time.
I think that's a good point. In fact, you were president of the Philosophical Society. And
for 18 years, the American Philosophical Society was created by, of course, the greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, and it was dedicated to the promotion of useful knowledge, not abstract and metaphysical knowledge, but useful, applied knowledge. And I was fortunate to be elected as a member. And then I was even more fortunate to be named as the president of the American Philosophical Society, a post which I held for 18 years, although I must say I was not very often there.
Well, I guess my point would be, or my question would be, a philosophical society meant something different during your time than it does during mine.
Yes, we called the study of the cosmos, the study of the universe, the study of everything outside of ourselves, natural philosophy. And we did not mean by that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Heraclitus. We meant the understanding of how the world works in in systematic ways, not just observing this species or that cloud, but attempting to build system, to understand patterns, to be able to distinguish between one species and the next, to be able to determine that a nimbus cloud is not the same as a cumulus cloud, and that an animal coming from, let's say, Africa might be related to an American bison, but it might be quite distinct either as a subspecies or possibly as another species altogether. This is essentially what we mean by natural philosophy.
And so perhaps it would be more accurate to call you a statesman of philosophy than a statesman of science.
An information gatherer, a person, my three heroes were Bacon, Locke, and Newton. And Locke, best known for the second treatise on government, is more important to me as the father of epistemology. He's the one who taught us that at birth the mind is a blank slate, and that therefore what we inscribe on that slate, how we educate that person, what stimuli enter that person's brain, creates the person. And so if you are born in Egypt but transported at birth to France, you're going to learn French, not Arabic. Your religion is probably going to be Christian rather than Islamic. Your real cultural output is going to be European rather than North African, and so on. That humans are the same everywhere, but what is laid down on the tabula rasa of their brains is determined by environment, by social structure, by language, by cultural and religious traditions, and so on, and that each person is formed by a series of stimuli that come from the outside in. Plato believed that we're born with certain innate understandings and ideas. I simply disagree 100% with that. So that was Locke. Bacon, in some ways more important than Locke, said that we needed to stop deducing truth in a kind of medieval scholastic way, and we needed to work by induction. So we should look at 7 or 8 different types of petunia and not draw any conclusions. But as we gather more and more examples, to begin to say, oh, well, there are more pink ones than there are white ones, and this one has 7 petals and that one 4, and that carefully, by observation and the recording of data, you come to an understanding. And only at the end of this process, when you have patiently gathered all of this data, do you then begin to sort it out and to make careful hypotheses. But you mustn't rush to judgment and rush to a premature hypothesis. And then finally, Newton, the greatest perhaps human being who ever lived on Earth, the last of my trinity of heroes, Newton is the one who realized that there is the world and things happen in that world. Carriages tip over and storms come from the west, and one person is 6 feet tall and another person is only 4 feet tall, and wars break out, and there's volcanism and earthquakes and so on, that there's a world of seeming things, but it's not as random as it might appear, and that if you study it carefully, you can pierce through the chaotic surface of things and find the underlying order beneath it. And of course, his greatest single achievement was realizing that gravitation is a constant, and that it can be measured, and that you can explain everything by the theory of gravitation. That it explains the way the moon goes in the universe. It explains how the Earth travels around the sun. It explains how an object falls from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and hits the ground. That gravitation is a simple, unerring constant. And once you understand this, it explains everything. It explains all motion of all objects.
Perhaps, sir, you'd be willing to share with us what you felt were the greatest scientific advancements of your time.
Well, there's science and there's technology. Technology is simpler to talk about. The coming of the steam engine, for example, is something that happened within my lifetime. And even though it really hadn't found its full application yet, When I first saw a steam engine in London, when I went there to meet with John Adams in 1786, I immediately thought, oh, this is revolutionary. This is going to change everything. Because up till this time, if you wanted to plow, that meant either a human was pulling that plow or an oxen or a horse. If you wanted to go to Europe, that meant a sailboat. You couldn't row your way to Europe. Everything had to be done with extremely primitive motive power, and human thighs and shoulders and backs were the essential motive force. When Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri in 1804, they propelled themselves against that mighty river, which runs at 3 or 4 or 5 miles per hour, with the backs and thighs of these remarkable young men that they gathered. And they didn't want gentlemen's sons. They wanted men with strong thighs and strong backs and a high threshold of pain and a capacity for physical endurance. So when I saw coal being burned and through a series of vessels being created into a potent force, steam, I realized that this, if they could figure out how to apply it and to contain it and to make sure that the vessels didn't explode, that this would change everything. And in a sense, the whole future of the world was going to be different thanks to steam power.
Oh, I must ask you, Mr. Jefferson, did you ever ride on a steam-powered vessel?
No, I never rode in a balloon, and I never rode in a steamboat. But I knew that Robert Fulton had begun regular steamboat service from Albany to New York City, and my granddaughters, a couple of them, actually had a sort of pleasure excursion on the James River at Richmond, I think around 1815. So I myself never was in one of these vessels, but I know people who were.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break from this conversation, but we'll return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
We were talking about science before we took our break, and I had asked you about what you felt were the greatest scientific breakthroughs of your time. Could we return to that, sir?
Well, I had mentioned in technology the hot air balloon, which was, I think, very promising, although a little bit hard to steer. And then the coming of steam, which I did not really live to see, but I knew that it was going to be a great thing. In simpler terms, something like the polygraph, which you would call a pantograph, but a copying machine. That may seem of minor significance to you, but it's really important for government, for the creation of archives and records.
If I may interject,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Jefferson, just so you recognize that during my time, one is able to make exact copies of documents instantly. Almost anyone can do this. So for my time, that doesn't sound like such a great achievement. For your time, it was a very large achievement.
Yes, it was high tech for my time. The polygraph, as I called it, I did not invent. I purchased it, but I made some improvements and developed a laptop version of it. It consisted of a couple of pens that were linked by pulleys and levers, and 2 sheets of paper which were attached to an inclined plane, a desk. And then as you wrote one copy, the other one repeated the first pattern as if by magic. That shortened the time it took me to correspond and to make copies of important documents dramatically. It's nothing compared to what you've since produced. You can imagine that if I had access to one of your copying machines.
The polygraph that you had, it is said you were not completely happy with the way it operated.
Here's the problem. The paper of my time was not smooth. It was handmade paper, and so there are irregularities in its surface. And these were pens that they had steel nibs, but they were essentially like a very primitive fountain pen. And so the ink is being held in a kind of suspension. And if you hit a snag in the paper, the ink tends to spill or the paper can tear. And of course, you constantly have to be inking up again. Each of the pens has only a limited inkwell. And so from your point of view, it would be a very tedious business to use this pantograph. But from my point of view, it was little short of a technological miracle. And I actually ordered them for my friends. I gave Mr. Madison one. I gave other of my friends copies because I thought this would so ease their lives and facilitate record keeping. And I would give anything if we had more records of the deliberations of the Second Continental Congress, which is where I served and from which I wrote the Declaration of Independence. I later was talking with historians in the period after I left the presidency, lamenting that an accurate history of the revolution will never be written. We just don't have the documents. We had no way to record the deliberations, and so this is a serious lament because the principles that we were laying down, the debates that we were having about natural law and natural right, were not just debates for our revolution. They were debates for mankind. They were debates about the future of the human project. So you live in a great period in which you can make copies of absolutely everything. When I for example, wrote out a classification system for my library of about 7,000 volumes, you can imagine how tedious that was. And then I had to make a copy for the Congress. And the only way to do it was to take out more paper, sit down, and start over. And so these things are of extraordinary importance.
There's another thing that you invented, sir, that I found fascinating, a wheel cipher. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I'm a private person, a very private person, and in some respects a secretive one. And the post offices, such as they were in my era, were corrupt. The postmasters routinely opened people's mail. People would gather around in the post office and wait for the mail to come through, and they would open anything that suited them and sometimes take extracts, write down extracts, and read them aloud to each other and make sarcastic statements and, generally speaking, invade human privacy. The laws that protect the integrity of the mails had not yet been passed in my time, and even if they had been, they would have been routinely violated by these unscrupulous postmasters, many of whom were buffoons and worse. So I often sent important letters by courier. I would just hire somebody who happened to be going to Richmond or happened to be going to Philadelphia to carry them in his bag, and then he would hand deliver these letters or dispatches to the intended recipient. But that's expensive and it's inconvenient and it's not at all a reliable system. So I then developed a series of encryption devices, you'd call them. But the one you're talking about is the Cipher Wheel, and it has the alphabet on it. There's a wheel for each letter of the alphabet and numbers, and then every letter of the alphabet is chiseled or inscribed on the outside of the wheel, and the whole thing, all 26 of these, are put together with a rod going through the center of them. They're discs, and then that rod can be tightened down, and you create a sample sentence, and then you turn the wheel to one of the many other possibilities. The probability theory of 26 letters is essentially infinite. And then you create a sample sentence and tell people how to tune the cipher. And at that point, there's nobody who can crack that code. In fact, I'm told that the encryption wheel that I developed, the Cipher Wheel, was used by the United States intelligence services through your World War II. It's such a good system. And I used it chiefly in letters to Madison and Monroe. But I also gave a two-dimensional version of it to Meriwether Lewis and showed him how to do it in case he needed to send sensitive dispatches from the upper Missouri that might fall into the hands of the Spanish or the British. He was prepared to engage in encryption, if necessary, on his historic journey.
In any event, a very complex tool that you invented. I actually understand some versions of it had 36 wooden discs, but I take your point, sir.
I think you can buy them in your time at Monticello and other places. And I invite everyone to take a look at it. I know you have electronic encryption in your time, which is probably superior to my system. But my system worked for a very long time, and I was very proud of it.
It's safe to say, sir, that you popularized the notion that the pursuit of scientific endeavors is an American ideal and one that's crucial to our country. You wrote, "Science has liberated the ideas of those who read and reflect, and the American example has kindled feelings of right in the people."
Well, I remember that Isaac Newton, the greatest of my heroes, said something to the effect of, "If I have seen farther than others and accomplished more, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants." I had a library, 3 of them altogether, but the main one of about 7,000 volumes. I sold it to the Congress of the United States in 1814 and 1815 after the British burned the national capital to the ground. But those books enabled me to see what Montaigne saw and to see what Montesquieu saw and to see how Machiavelli viewed the world, or to see the world through the eyes of Homer or Virgil or Tacitus or Livy. I could look at the world whimsically as Cervantes did in Don Quixote, or I could look at the world sarcastically and ironically as Jonathan Swift did in A Tale of a Tub or Gulliver's Travels. And so when you read, you not only have the opportunity to learn a great deal that you would have a hard time compiling yourself. Somebody else has done all that work. Somebody else has written the book on the circulation of the blood. Somebody else has written the book on the taxonomy of clouds. Once this happens, once somebody has done all the hard work and written it down accurately, then that becomes another step in the ascent of humankind, and we can never not know those things. And somebody else then comes along and popularizes it. The good case is Newton. He wrote his Principia, which is one of the most seminal books in the history of the word, and yet it's in Latin and it's quite difficult, and so most people have never read it, even in my own lifetime. But Voltaire, the great French philosophe, popularized Newton by paraphrasing the results of the Principia, and in many respects, Voltaire did more for Newton's ideas than Newton himself, because Newton had written in the language of learning, Latin, with a very strong base in mathematics, including even calculus, which he helped to invent. And the average, even well-educated person was going to have a hard time with that. But Voltaire did that secondary work for civilization, the synthetic work of looking at primary contributions to knowledge and then popularizing them for a much wider audience. And so, I was fortunate. I was a reader. I had access to books. I had a ready mind, and I took good notes. And so I was able to take advantage of all of this really unbelievable intellectual and creative work that had been done from the time of the Old Testament until my own day. And I never understood why any rational human being would turn away from that as a way to improve himself. I once wrote that businessmen, can probably get by with good sense and native wit and a basic capacity for communication. But imagine if they had also become men of learning, how much greater their achievement might have been.
You talked about your heroes and about mathematics. I understand that you preferred sciences which were informed, quote, by the aid of mathematical calculation, because, as you put it, no two men can differ on a principle of trigonometry.
That is correct. So mathematics is in a sense the universal language of the Enlightenment, because 2 + 2 = 4, not 6, not 3, not 1. And two people who are separated in every other way, a Federalist and a Republican, or a Tory and a Minuteman, or a Muslim and a Christian, or a Jew or a Gentile, or a black person or a white person, a Chinaman or a native of the Sioux world of the upper Missouri, they can all agree that 2 + 2 is 4. This is universal. And ideology, race, gender, social structures, prejudices about the nature of life do not bear on questions of truth. And so, we must use language. Not everything can be reduced to mathematics, but whatever can be reduced to mathematics is reliable. I'm not in favor of metaphysics. I don't believe that anything exists beyond that which is measurable. I believe in physics. I believe that everything can be measured, and if it can't be measured, it probably doesn't exist, which is why I disputed in my own version of the New Testament the idea that Jesus, for example, turned water into wine. This is a chemical impossibility. You would require faith or metaphysics to believe that this could have been true, or psychology at the very least. But if you stay in the world of the measurable and gave the greatest scientists in the world, Newton, Locke, Bacon, you name it, gave them all 100 gallons of water and said, you can have 1 million pounds sterling if you can turn this into wine, they would never be able to do it because it is metaphysics. It is beyond physics, and therefore, in some sense, to me, it's nonsense. It's nonsense.
We've talked about some of the things that you invented, some of the things you helped to invent or reinvent. But perhaps the most important technological device, at least the most widely used of your time, you helped to reinvent in a great way, and that was the common plow, the Moldboard plow. And you use scientific principles that came from Newton.
Newton and Leibniz. Newton and Leibniz were one British, one German. They invented calculus, without which I could not have done this.
But it had a tremendous effect on farmers of your time, and it said that you thought agricultural science and technology was probably the most important science. Is that fair?
Again, going back to Franklin's American Philosophical Society, dedicated to the promotion of useful knowledge. So the one thing that all human beings have to do is to eat. Not everyone requires to live in a brick house, and not everyone needs to wear wool. Not everyone needs to read books. But assuredly, we do need to eat. If we don't eat, we die. And so food production, farming, is, in my opinion, the most important thing that humans do. And that's why I have a particular love of family farms and believe that we would be a great and independent nation as long as the great majority of us were farmers, and not afterwards, once we began to crowd into cities, which I regard as so many cancer sores on the face of the body politic. So you can come at plowing from one of two directions. At the creature that pulls the plow, the motive force, or the shape of the plow. And it's important to do both. So steam, as we were saying, if you can figure out a way to do it, could pull a plow, even a very inefficient plow, in a way maybe that oxen could not. And that coal-fired steam engine could work 24 hours a day, whereas the oxen would have to be rested for significant periods. But another way to go about this is to work on the plowshare. And if you think about it, what a plow does is it pierces the earth, it cuts the earth, and then it lifts the earth and it turns it. That's the operation of a plow. It's a very gross business. It's not the flight of a butterfly or a kite.
But again, back to Franklin's practical science. Most of America was living on a farm. Most Americans were farmers, and you provided them really a giant technological leap in a simple everyday effort that they had.
I used calculus, thanks to Leibniz and Newton, and I developed this plow, what I call the Moldboard of least resistance, which I should just say, I won't go into the details, but it reduced to a minimum the friction of plowing. It's always going to be a grossly difficult business, but by using calculus, you can make a moldboard that limits the friction as much as it is possible to limit the friction. That's what I did. And then, as you say, I did not patent it because why? Because how dare I try to profit from this when this can ease the lives of thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals?
Mr. Jefferson, I must interrupt you.
Sir.
It would be the natural inclination of almost anyone to say, okay, I've made this thing better and I deserve to be rewarded from it. You did not, sir, and you were recognized in Europe and America for providing this invention and not charging for it.
Sir, I believe that an idea is discovered, it's uncovered, and once so, it belongs to the universe. It does not belong to the person who happened to find it. And if we create monopolies on invention, we will limit the dissemination of things that could improve the life of humankind. It just wouldn't seem appropriate to me to try to patent such a device.
And I absolutely agree with your point, sir. I am just trying to make it known that you did this, and you did it without monetary reward, and many should thank you for it.
You are most welcome, sir, and if I made life of the American farmer a little bit less onerous, I could not be more delighted.
Sir, there's so much more I'd like to talk to you about, but sadly we're going to have to take a break from this conversation at this point. Perhaps we can revisit this subject again.
Indeed, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, not in the barn. I'm actually in studio today with the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
And we talked about Jefferson and philosophy/science. And one thing we didn't get to that I was hoping we could touch on was Robert Fulton. I had no idea that they had such a relationship, the two of these men.
They corresponded. Fulton went to Paris, and in Paris he began to work with steam, and he actually created steamboats. So basically the predecessor of the steamboat, and it worked. And so he came back to this country, and he tried to get interest in a whole range of places, but the only place he could really find the right conditions was on the Hudson between Albany and New York. And so he experimented with steam-powered boats, and they were beginning to run regular to and fro excursions in his time, and it actually made some money. And so this then was the beginning of the age of steam, and people were watching this and saying, well, if it can be used on water, what if you had a land machine, a locomotive that could go, say, on rails and overcome the great distances of our republic? So Fulton is a very important figure in this, and as usual, Jefferson was on to him, and they were corresponding, and Jefferson was wanting to know everything he could know about this extraordinary new source of motive power.
What struck me is the fascination the two men held for the use of torpedoes. and there's these great pieces of correspondence. Jefferson wrote March 1810, "Your torpedoes will be to cities what vaccination has been to mankind." They thought that the invention of torpedoes was going to end naval warfare.
Right. Well, guess what? But the torpedoes were pretty primitive. The first torpedoes, you had to swim to the hull.
Kind of like mines.
And you attach a mine to the hull of the ship, and then you swim like crazy.
But he did, Fulton did conduct a successful test and blew up a small warship. And but I just, I get it. Jefferson's such a gadget guy and so interested in technology, but it still surprised me. I had no idea.
Well, so the correspondence is interesting. I've been looking at it over the past couple of weeks, and Fulton is way more interesting than just steam. He was dabbling in everything, including the fine arts. He was a painter for a time. But here's what's so interesting about this from a Jeffersonian point of view. The big question for Jefferson and Madison was, how are we going to knit this country together? It's too big. You can't have a republic if it's that spread out. And so they were looking for methods to overcome time and distance. And so steam played this gigantic role in the history of the American West. As you know, North Dakota was made possible by the Northern Pacific Railroad, which came across the state in the 1870s and early 1880s. It allowed Theodore Roosevelt to come here to kill his buffalo, and he fell in love with the place. It helped us end the Indian Wars. Unfortunately, it also helped to bring the buffalo nearly to extinction. Along came the telegraph in the 1840s, even more revolutionary in a certain way. And now instead of taking 10 days or 3 weeks for a letter to get from St. Joseph to Sacramento or San Francisco, it could go instantly at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. And I was reading about this, David, about the way technologies work in this country. The minute the telegraph lines were up, almost that day, the Pony Express collapsed. The Pony Express worked until it didn't. And the minute there was a telegraph, instead of 10 days of people just like riding as hard as you could possibly ride, coming to the next station, throwing themselves off the horse, having a quick drink of water, getting on another horse, galloping off, and doing that from St. Joseph all the way to San Francisco with Native Americans stopping you and thugs and thieves and road warriors the whole way, and deserts and rainstorms and blizzards and snowstorms. The minute they had the telegraph, they said, that's the end of the Pony Express, and it died instantly, just as the steamboat era on the Missouri River died the day railroads made it possible to overcome that very inefficient motive power. So this is all part of technology and our republic. And Jefferson and Madison were looking for any way to tie this great country together. And steam power was clearly going to be one of the sources of that victory.
Well, we started this conversation with President Jefferson, revisiting him and his difficulty in accepting the fact that America had landed men on the moon.
I still don't believe it.
And
Sound studio.
Yeah. But then we really talked about Jefferson and his scientific involvement, his inventions, and there's a lot of things that he was either involved in the improvement of or outright inventing. There's a few that we didn't get to that I thought were pretty interesting.
Such as?
Well, one was the great clock. Obviously,
he did not invent that, but he
didn't
bought
invent
it.
the clock, but he
did drill the holes in the floor.
And he improved on it.
Right. The calendar clock in the lobby, which not only tells the time of the day, but also the day of the week with these balls, these weights that descend to the floor and then eventually go through. And then he painted Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in placards over on the wall.
What I didn't know about it is that it had a very large gong or bell, which was loud enough to be heard 3 miles away.
He also invented this folding ladder. So he invented a ladder. It's like a Ginsu ladder. It folds up into like a pillar, and then you fold it out, and you put it in the corner so then he could climb up once a week. He was, of course, the most orderly of all human beings. He'd climb up and wind the weights back up to the ceiling. One set of weights moved the mechanism of the clock, and the other one told the day of the week. And Jefferson, just with his usual rage for order, would use his invented Ginsu ladder and then go up and twist the weights back up to the ceiling.
And you alluded to this earlier, but people who don't know it didn't fit.
Didn't fit, so he had to drill holes in the floor to make it fit.
Which you can still see.
It just tells you everything you want to know about Jefferson, that he so loved this thing that he was willing to drill holes through the floor and then you go into the basement and it says Saturday. You got to go down there to see the last of it.
We talked about a couple of things. The polygraph, which was really big to him,
his
practical.
Pantograph. And you kind of sneered at it like, wow, we have copying machines.
No, I wanted to make it known that that was a big deal. We take it for granted is what I was sneering at.
Just imagine trying to cut the quills, if you're using quills, or to make the steel nibs work, and then getting the ink into them, and then positioning the paper, and then starting off, and then it spills, and you start over. But he perfected it, and he made it work, and he, as I like to say, he created a laptop version of it for his travels. When Jefferson got onto an idea, he was like a child with just glee. And then everyone he knew, there's this famous letter that he wrote to Madison from France where he bought him a pedometer. So, we have Fitbits and so on. Pedometer then meant a kind of a clock-like mechanism, a watch, but you had to have a string that came out of it, and the string was attached to your garter below your knee. And you had to tune this thing in a certain way so that your leg would move the mechanism of the pedometer without breaking the string and so on. And so Jefferson gets one and masters it, of course. And then all of his letters are filled with how many miles he walked. And then he sends one to Madison, like with a 5-page letter of instruction on how to use it. You think of poor Madison getting this thing and realizing, wow, That's a pretty inefficient pedometer. But thank goodness Mr. Jefferson wrote 5 full pages of instruction.
Another one we didn't touch on, which I thought was pretty cool, is the revolving book stand, because it's kind of like a computer of Windows where you can have multiple things that you can jump around.
I thought about it in that way. You're absolutely. I have 2 of them at my house.
But the one that I tried to stress at the end and give due credit was the plow.
I like your Windows idea. That's a tremendous insight about that 5-sided.
Yeah, because
maybe a music stand, maybe a book stand. We're not quite sure.
He could jump from idea to idea
right,
to
and
idea.
And then he had this lazy Susan desk, and then he had this lazy Susan book stand. So you just say, "Oh, I'm not going to look at Linnaeus now. I'm going to look at X," and then turn
or
turn
cross-reference or anything.
Doing research. Well, the plow.
The plow is really.
He won the
big
Paris Agricultural Prize for 1806 as the best agricultural invention of the age. He sees this guy plowing, thinks, this could be done better. I'll just use calculus. And so he sits down and develops what he called the Moldboard of least resistance, and by golly, it is. It's like the perfect plowshare because it reduces to the statistical minimum to turn the earth.
And he didn't take credit for it. Here, this guy who died in such debt, he could have made a great deal of money.
My favorite Jefferson line of all: "He who takes an idea from me informs himself without disinforming me, just as he who lights his torch from my candle." It's so great.
It is.
That's how his mind worked. Now, our view is maybe one patent. Just do one patent. Then you can save Monticello and your daughter can live in some kind of dignity.
It was a real fun conversation we had with Mr. Jefferson this week. I thank him for it, and I thank you, sir. But now it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
The semi-permanent guest host rebukes me for all the begging I do here on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I think you know I'm mostly joking, but do send books, gas cards, wine, Yeti coolers, and titles to your ranch, all in good fun. But here is what I really want from you. Help this program go viral. Tell everyone you know. Go to your Facebook site and share the latest episode with all your network, and write something personal urging people to listen to 5 podcasts and decide for themselves if they wish to continue, and then urge them to share their enthusiasm with their own social networks. If we had 10 million listeners, rather than several 100,000, we could make a big difference in our national conversation. A book I wrote 15 or more years ago, Becoming Jefferson's People, has been out of print for 18 months or so. Here at the Jefferson Hour, we have decided to reissue the book with a few things corrected, an important new introduction, and at the end, a new extended interview. I've changed the title to Jefferson's America, A Citizen's Guide to Civility and Enlightenment. The cover is gorgeous. It should be available at the end of this calendar year. I'll update you as I know more. I ask you to buy copies of the book and give them to your friends as gifts for a more enlightened world. I'm not doing this to make money. I'm doing this because I believe the United States is teetering on the edge of a cliff that separates the Roman Republic from the Roman Empire, with its violence, madness, and disintegration, followed by 1,000 years of darkness. If you listen to the Jefferson Hour because it is civil, calm, well, usually, and we speak in complete sentences, and because it is clear that we believe in the idea of an American republic, imagine if we could get that level of sane analysis and discourse into the ears of tens of millions of people. My goal is to get the book into the hands of every legislator in the country. If you figure approximately 150 legislators per state, 50 states plus Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, etc., we're talking about roughly 5,000 books, packaged with a personal note from you urging them to spend an evening reading the book. This could make a difference. Imagine if a state senator from Idaho quoted a passage from the book on the floor of the chamber, or if a national political candidate was seen carrying a copy of Jefferson's America. I'd also like to get some regional and major media for the book. If you can help, let us know. I'm not looking for fame here, but access. A couple of appearances with Chris Cuomo or Lawrence O'Donnell or Tucker Carlson, for that matter, and a wry conversation with Bill Maher would make all the difference. Imagine if I could say to Don Lemon or Sean Hannity, well, I just urge people to listen to the Thomas Jefferson Hour and decide for themselves what Jefferson would think about what's going on in this country. My core conviction is that the American people are less divided than they seem. that the American people are hungry for something more authentic in the national arena, that people are more reasonable and open-minded than they might seem, that the name-calling and the brickbats and the shouting down may be entertaining, but most Americans want their country to be more like what the Founding Fathers dreamed it would be, that Americans are naturally idealistic and naturally optimistic. I believe that we can talk about anything if we do so with real respect, humor, and good sense. I believe that we can be playful about serious ideas, and I believe that language is a moral instrument that must be used carefully, but not pretentiously, if we're going to recover. I met an incredible group of people on coastal Georgia last week. They listened to the program with a kind of care and attention to detail that would have made me blush if it had not so resonated with my life's purpose and my deepest passion about American renewal. It was like meeting my highest fantasy of perfect listeners. They knew about my Lewis and Clark cultural tours and pledged to come next summer. They knew about my plans to drive a truck camper around in search of America in a manner of John Steinbeck's younger brother, Chip Steinbeck, and they wanted to talk gear. They knew that my dream is to get my new book into the hands of legislators and opinion makers. They were finishing my sentences, and they could quote accurately from previous Jefferson Watch essays. One of them was a self-described superfan, but all 12 were smart, funny, highly articulate, idealistic, civil, and public-spirited. It was like being at one of Maria Cosway's salons in Paris, where Jefferson said all the rough edges and rudenesses of life had been rubbed off into perfectly intelligent social harmony. Coastal shrimp, Sauvignon Blanc, and a spirited conversation in which nobody dominated, while we had to sit on the superfan at times, with wit and laughter and moments of a poignant sense that something magical was unfolding. We had one of the great evenings of my life. They all want to live in a more enlightened world, and none of us could understand why things have gone so badly off the rails. They were not content to wring their hands. Thoreau said, "Men will lie on their backs talking about the fall of man and never make an effort to get up." Not my new friends from the Barrier Islands. They are closer to the Greek philosopher Archimedes, who said, "Give me a place to put the lever, and I will move the world." I've invited them to visit North Dakota, and they all made lying promises that they would do so. My dream is that we can somehow start a Jeffersonian movement that will help to heal America. Civility, rationality, real equality of opportunity, harmony, education, devotion to science, and a deep generosity of spirit. After a period of great political tension, Jefferson's successor James Monroe presided over what historians have called the era of good feelings. Suddenly, everyone calmed down and realized that whatever was wrong with America was minuscule compared to all that was right and good about this experiment in self-government and self-actualization. I believe that what Jefferson stood for, not perhaps who he was, is precisely what America most needs. I wish I had a bigger megaphone, because if we could get the attention of the 75 million Americans who are not blind spouters of somebody else's talking points, I believe we could still turn this slow-motion national collapse around. I believe we can germinate a new era of good feelings. I only write these words today because my meeting with the lovely, whimsical Jeffersonians of South Georgia taught me that it would be insane to set limits on the leavening power of the Enlightenment. If they represent one pocket of remarkable Americans who want better and are prepared to put their money where their mouths are, imagine how many other Jeffersonian cells we might be able to plant in the sewage lagoon of Hamiltonian greed and lust for power. Meanwhile, just send me the ranch. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.